Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. It's wonderful to have a room full of people again. Almost the first time since the dreaded events of the last couple of years. And we're very, very pleased to welcome our speaker this evening, and indeed our colleagues online, for something which is really a fascinating lecture. The topic, of course, the role of language in Turkish society is one of the things that we all have found really, really important since the beginning of our studies. When one thinks about it, we not only have the Ottoman script and the very curious things such as the Sultan might write in Persian, whilst the Shah of Iran might write in Turkish with its wonderful inversions, and then we have the situation where even after the foundation of the Republic, much of the early Republican literature, of course, is still in the Ottoman script or the Arabic script. And then it gradually becomes converted. And then the fact that, of course, every decade, modern Turkish has changed so much. It's actually quite difficult for any of us now to go back and read books from the 1960s, for example. So the whole question of the fluidity of language in modern Turkey is something which we really, really should be aware about. And of course, how we translate it, which brings us to our speaker today. And Jack Snowden is, in fact, a retired diplomat. So I'm sure that he won't mind at all if you ask him questions about delicate matters of international diplomacy.
Retired.
But today he's going to talk about his work that he's built up since then on translating the Ottoman world. And we're very pleased to welcome our speaker here to the Institute Mount of the Anglo-Turkish Society. So thank you very much.
And it's my honor, of course, to be here and to have been asked to come by your wonderful society. Let me begin by paying my condolences and respects to the late Queen Elizabeth, who was quite a lady and very much like my own mother, Mary, in terms of character and generation. So I felt that her passing a little personally, perhaps. And then next, I would like to thank the Anglo-Turkish Society for discovering me. However that happened, I don't know. But it's a wonderful coincidence that we are all together here today. And I guess we have academia to thank for this convergence. Academia, I assume most of you know, is sort of a worldwide web of people who are connected and share their work without the intervention of those horrid publishers and booksellers and people like that. And that has been a liberating force, it seems to me, for a lot of people, to be able to put their material out to the world, and literally to the world, because rather than go to a bookstore to find a book, you can just jump on your computer and on academia in particular. And I am shocked every day to see where in the world people are looking at the things that I have worked on. So let me now explain how in the world I got here. And that's a story in and of itself. After I finished university, I went into the United States Air Force, and they decided that I was going to learn Turkish. And I didn't know where Turkey was. I didn't know what Turkish was. I didn't know what a Turk was. And this was in 1974. But obviously it changed my life. So I went out to California to the Defense Language Institute and spent a year learning basic Turkish, and then worked in the Defense Department, the US Defense Department, for about 35 years, doing various different things, language, not only Turkish, but Urdu and Hindi and the Central Asian languages as well. But as I was telling David before, throughout my association with modern Turkish, the shadow of Ottoman Turkish was always there in the background, because it seemed that at the time that I was in Turkey in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, Ottoman was essentially repressed for political reasons, perhaps. But then in the early 2000s, it began to reappear or become a popular subject for people to work on and to study. And this coincided, of course, with the Erdogan arrival at that time. So I decided to retire in 2006 and had to decide on, and as we all do when we retire, we have to decide on what we're going to do henceforth. I don't play golf, so that was not an option. And I knew that I had to do something otherwise, because I had seen so many people, so many colleagues who had retired and either melted away or were dying to get back in the office. And I didn't want to do either of those. So I decided that a bottomless pit or a endless well of sorts would be Ottoman. Studying Ottoman, and that has proven to be the case over the last 15 years, as I have gotten into it and worked on various aspects of it. You have probably seen the movie Forrest Gump, in which his mother, Sally Field, says, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Well, that's essentially what I face every day, in the sense that I look for something to work on, and I'm never quite sure what I'm going to find, except for the first project that I worked on. And I'll show you something now that you will find hard to believe. It seems to be a physical impossibility. But when I was studying early in 2008 in Istanbul at the Tarih Vakfı, which is a historical organization in Turkey that gives courses on various things, and they were giving a course on Ottoman, and I attended. Was a lady there who later became my wife, but whose grandfather had been a soldier in World War I and was taken prisoner by the Russians and sent to a prison camp in east of Moscow, where he spent a couple of years. But throughout that time, he kept a diary. And he kept that diary. I don't know if anybody, if folks outside can see this, but he kept a diary in these notebooks, which you can see, written with ink and needle. And there are two notebooks.
Can you show it to your mic, little webcam at the top there?
Okay.
Yeah, okay, there we go. Yeah, because well, you won't be able to see, but I can see it here. That's perfect.
Okay, and these little notebooks were never transcribed or translated. They were the possession or the heritage from this soldier of my wife's family. And my wife was in the class because she was trying to learn Ottoman in order to translate and transcribe these. And when we got married, as a retiree, the mission fell to me, which was fine. And I spent a couple of years, as you can imagine, trying to get through this. And we ultimately published this book in 2010. I don't know if our folks can see that.
Yeah.
It's the modern Turkish transcription of these little notebooks.
Should we pass it around?
Yes, by all means. And you know, people can look at these as well. Just and I've also done my own self-published version in English, and it's also available on on my website, as or my blog site, I should say, which is that's another thing we'll talk about. But this is the English version of that, and the book which I've sent around. And it's a phenomenal story, of course, as you can imagine, a soldier going out from Istanbul in 1915. I think it was January of 1915, just after the Battle of Sarıkamış. He goes out to Erzurum and fights against the Russians for about a year. And then when the Russians took Erzurum, he became a prisoner and then was sent by train up to this POW camp, where he spent a couple of years. And in the course of that time, the Russian Revolution occurred, and that helped in him finally being released and returning back to Istanbul. But an amazing story. But that was my first introduction, baptism of fire, I guess you could say, in terms of Ottoman. And the degree of difficulty was pretty severe, but I had a lot of help and got through it. And then we did the book and then the translation. But the translation has not been published in book form like the transcription has. But in any event, what I wanted to do this evening is to a theme of Box of Chocolates is to show you the variety of topics and subjects that appear. And these things have never, to my knowledge, been translated into English. And I feel this is a self-assigned mission, but I feel it is my mission in my retirement to translate these things into English so that they're available to people, the Turks. And it's been a lot of fun. It really has been. And as I say, the reaction via academia is worldwide. And I'll show you some examples of that as we move along. So we're translating from the Ottoman world. We're translating Ottoman material, but we're also translating Turkish, modern Turkish alphabet publications that have already transcribed from Ottoman by somebody else. So I find these things either that have already been published in modern Turkish based on transcriptions from Ottoman, or I do the Ottoman transcriptions myself, as I did with the notebooks. So as we move along, as I said, don't squint and burn your eyes on this. Actually, I was born and raised in New York City, learned Turkish in the Air Force, as I said. Then I went out to Turkey and Pakistan and Central Asia and other crazy things. But, for a bureaucrat, I had a lot of fun in my career. But then I decided in 2006 to retire and then focus, as I said, on Ottoman. So first, I'll talk about the books that I have translated from Ottoman times, either Ottoman itself or Turkish that has already been transcribed from Ottoman. And the first one, as I said, is this one, the notebooks that you see around the table. And this is essentially a summary of that story, which I just told at length. And now I'll get into some of the other things that that I've worked on that are pretty unique and have never been seen in any other language other than Turkish that I know of. And this one was I think one of the first ones that I worked on after the notebooks. It's these books that were already transcribed by other folks, and they're printed in modern Turkish letters. And the amazing coincidence is that these two fellows were crew members on one of two Ottoman ships that went from Istanbul headed towards Basra in Iraq. This is before the Suez Canal opened. This is in 1865, 1866. And they're having a heck of a time getting through the Mediterranean. They get stuck in Cadiz in Spain for about maybe 6 months, not a year, but about 6 months because of the weather and other problems with their craft. But then they, as you can see on the map, when they got down a ways about where the equator is, and as I mentioned here, one of the interesting aspects was that sailors who had never been in this part of the world they knew about the equator, and they knew there was this line called the equator that split the earth in two. So when the captain said, okay, we're crossing the equator, they're all out there looking, where's the line? And unfortunately, or fortunately, they didn't find it. But anyway, one of these fellows was like a true sailor, an engineer. And so he writes in that same way, and it's really step by step and date by date and point by point. And the other guy was an imam, a religious clergyman, who was on the ship as well. He was the ship's imam, the same way that a ship has a chaplain in the US or the British Navy or whatever. So they get down to between Africa and South America, and big storm hits and they get blown off course and they end up in Rio de Janeiro. And the imam stays there and tends to the African Muslims who had been brought to Brazil as slaves. So he finds them and gets with them and decides that he'd like to stay, and the captain says, okay, you stay. And then the other fellow got back on, and they made the two ships made it all the way to Basra. And then I put the two stories together in this publication, and as you can see, the title is a bit whimsical, but not entirely. Accidental Turks in Brazil and Beyond. So this is a fascinating adventure for me, and a lot of this is selfish in terms of selecting what to do, and not that anybody's assigning me these things. I just I find stuff I'm interested in, and I work on it. And the story of this one was a friend of mine whose grandfather was Hüseyin Cahit Yalçın, who was a very famous Turkish writer and politician since the early part of the 20th century. And I did a manuscript that I got from this friend of mine, his grandfather's manuscript. It was about the Quran, and it was the Quran, Islam according to the Quran, without the intervention of the ulema, the clergymen. So this was, he wrote this book in the early 30s, and it was just too sensitive to publish. So it never got published until I worked on it maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And it is fascinating to see how he cuts out the Islamic clergy and essentially is telling people, you don't need the clergy. You can figure out the Quran without the clergy. But moving one step further, this friend of mine, his other grandfather was this fellow, Sami Çolgeçen, who was in imprisoned by Abdul Hamid II in Fezzan, which is in southwestern Libya. It's a prison colony for Ottoman bad boys. So he was out there and he didn't like it. So he decided that he was going to escape. And the only way to escape was across the Sahara Desert. And as you can imagine, it's quite a story. But that was another book that was in modern Turkish script. It had already been transcribed from Ottoman. So I translated the Turkish book into English, and that's what this is, and you can find this on Academia. The interesting thing for you folks here is that after he got across to Nigeria, he hopped on a boat and made it to Liverpool, and from Liverpool made it back to Istanbul. And by that time, his friends had taken over in Istanbul, the Young Turks. So they sent him back to the same place as the governor. These things, you know, it's hard to make these things up. It's impossible to make these things up. But that was another fascinating thing that I had to work on.
The Italians taken over for some very soon after that.
Yeah, certainly it was 1911, 1912 when the Italians, and he was governor at that time when the Italians, when that war began between the Turks and the Italians. And at the end, I have a special treat in that regard. So we'll get there in a little bit. Now this is, as I told you, that wrote those little notebooks. Went out to this prison camp on the train, and one of the fellows who was with him was a guy from Darende in Malatya province in Turkey. And this fellow, Tahir Baykal, shows up in the book that we published based on the transcription. And so his son, Tahir Baykal's son, Yurdakul Baykal, got in touch with me. And he said, hey, look, our grandfathers were together on the train going out to the prison camp. I said, wow, that's incredible. And then he told me that he had written a book about his father's adventures. So I translated that into English as well. And that's a remarkable story, even more remarkable than the story in the notebooks. And the ultimate oddity was that he roamed around as an escapee for a while around the Asian continent, all the way to Harbin, China. But then he got captured by the Bolsheviks and they put him in prison in Moscow. And one of his prison mates was the Khan of Khiva, who had been captured and deposed by the Bolsheviks. But there was nobody who could translate that language except for Tahir Baykal. So he was pressed into service as the translator for the Khan of Khiva in the prison in Moscow. Again, you can't make these things up. So that was another one that was just too irresistible. I had to do that one. Now this is one of my favorites because, and this was recommended to me by a fellow named Sinan Kuneralp, who is coincidentally the cousin of your former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson is a vice president of our society.
Is he?
Yeah.
Well, tell him that his cousin put me onto this. Yeah.
Vice president.
Yeah. So this fellow in the early 1900s was given the mission by Abdul Hamid II to go to Ethiopia and establish relations with Menelik, Emperor Menelik in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa. And it's just a remarkable story of the there's not a lot about his meetings with Emperor Menelik, and I think that has to do with confidentiality. But it's very detailed in terms of the trek from Istanbul to Djibouti, and from Djibouti up to Addis Ababa, camping all the way, just craziness, you know. But got all the way up there and met with the emperor and established the relationship between the two emperors, and then made his way back to Istanbul. But the best thing about this for me is that so many people in Ethiopia have seen this. And you know, when you look on academia and you see who the readers are and where they're from, it just amazes me that all these people in Ethiopia, who obviously don't speak Turkish and don't know anything about this story, enough of them know English so that they can read this and take advantage of it. And this is, you know, this is what makes me feel like what I do is worthwhile, when I make available this kind of material to people who would not know about it otherwise. Yeah, but this is a great example of that. Now, this story is one that should be close to your heart here, because this fellow was a bona fide boxer. His name was Ahmet Esat Tomruk. Tomruk essentially means a wallop, and he was a bona fide, you know, champion boxer. But he had come here as a deckhand when he was, you know, a teenager, and learned English, as young people do, fluently. And then he went back to Turkey when the war broke out, when the First World War broke out, and he was pressed, probably willingly, into service as an intelligence officer. And he characterized himself as an American journalist for the most part, and just infiltrated into the Greek good offices of the Greeks and the Circassians, who were against Ataturk, or at that time, that's a step ahead. But initially, I think, who was it, Townshend, who had been the English commander in Iraq during World War I. He was sent in to his midst to try and cozy up to him as an American journalist. And then he reprised that role during the War of Independence in a number of circumstances. But he was exposed in Izmir by a fellow named Cherkes Etam, who was a notorious bandit who initially was on the side of the Kemalists, but then switched to the Greek side. But anyway, he fingered this fellow, and this guy went to prison in Izmir and then went to prison in Athens. Somehow survived, got out, and resumed his boxing career in Istanbul. But these things are, you know, just so entertaining to work on and then to read. So let's these, as I say, these stories know no bounds. This fellow was a Turkish policeman in occupied Istanbul around 1920, when the French and the English in particular were occupying Istanbul. And he intervened when a Turkish woman was being harassed by some African French soldiers, Senegalese soldiers. He intervened to try and protect the woman. And I think he shot the French Senegalese soldiers and they died. So given the situation in Istanbul at that time, he was handed over by his own police force to the French for trial, and tried and convicted and sent for 10 years to Devil's Island in South America and survived, and then came back to Istanbul after 10 years. Wild. Now, those are the books. I mean, those are officially the books, but I also find material on websites, Turkish Historical Society websites, and university websites that I work on if I find them interesting. And a lot of them have come from this magazine, which is the Askeri Mecmua. This is the military journal. The military journal that was published in the 1920s and beyond. But in the 1920s, it was still in Ottoman script. And many times, I love these things because they have stories that have been translated by the Turks at that time in the 20s from other languages, English, French, German, Russian. So you find gems here that you wouldn't find anyplace else. And I'll give you some examples. One was the German Trans-Caucasus expedition of 1918, when the Germans, desperate for minerals and fuel, sent an expedition of about 3,000 soldiers to the Caucasus to try and secure minerals and fuel. And this is at the same time that the Turkish Islamic army of the Caucasus was out there, and the Dunster force of the British army was quite a conglomeration of different folks out there. But I found that story here, as I did with a couple of other things. Most recently, the story of Grand Duke Nicholas, who was the commander of the Russian forces on the Caucasus front in World War I. And I'm working through that one. And one of the great things about this process is that at least you think you have come across a scoop, and I'm a journalist at heart, so any journalist loves to find a scoop. So I'm punching away on this one, which is pretty straightforward in terms of the Russian operations against the Turks in the summer of 1916, and also the Russian activities in Iran at that time, in collaboration with the British in Iraq against the Turks. All fascinating stuff. So I'm punching along on this one, and then I come to this part where the Grand Duke says, I order that suffocating gas be used against the Turks all across the front. And to my knowledge, this was, I don't know, I'm certainly no expert on the use of poison gas in World War I, but to my knowledge, this was the first indication that there was some thought of using gas warfare on that front. Whether it happened or not, I don't know, but the text was that I order that this suffocating gas be used against the Turks. But then there were a number of very good French stories written by French commanders who fought against the Turks in southeastern Turkey during the Turkish War of Independence. And these essentially books, they're long accounts by these French commanders. They were translated by the Turks into Ottoman Turkish, and I found them and translated them, transcribed them, and then translated them into English. And there are three of them in particular, three French officers describing the brutality and the horrors and the idiocy of war, essentially, for them, thousands of miles away from France, in the desolation of southeastern Turkey. But on the other hand, they were all dedicated to their mission and really gung-ho about the whole thing. But again, these are examples of material from other languages that were translated to Ottoman Turkish by the Turks, and then I stumble upon them and translate them, transcribe them into Turkish, and then into English, transcribe them from Ottoman into Turkish, and then from Turkish, translate them into English. Okay. And similarly, as the gentleman mentioned, there was a whole series of articles that the Turks translated about the war between Turkey and Italy that I just found to be fascinating. One of them was the 1911, I think it was, or 1912. The Italians tried to penetrate Çanakkale, the Strait of Çanakkale, which I didn't know anything about, and their invasion of Rhodes and their bombardment of Beirut, and then the conflict between the Turks and the Italians in the Red Sea. All of these things were things I had never known about, but fortunately, because the Turks had translated them from Italian into Turkish, I was able to stumble upon them and then translate them into English. But those are gems as far as I'm concerned. And then this is one for you folks in particular. This is about a Turk in English hands. This Turk was involved in as a member of the Teşkilat-ı, which was essentially the Turkish CIA during World War I, and he was involved in the deportations of the Armenians in southeastern Turkey. And then when the English occupied that area, Gaziantep today, and in those days Antep, they grabbed him on whatever pretext and sent him to prison camp near Cairo. And this is the story that I wrote afterwards of his capture and then his transit from Gaziantep, and then his life as a prisoner in the English prison camp near Cairo. So again, just all sorts of different material. I'm guessing that most of you have been to Istanbul and have ridden the ferries, as I have many, many times, but never give a second thought to World War I and the ferries being put into service in the war effort at that time. And this was a great article that I found by the company that ran and still runs the Istanbul ferry service about the details of the Istanbul ferries in World War I. I was surprised to learn, for instance, that up until that point, all of the coal that the ferries ran on in Istanbul had come from England. But of course, when the war began and England became an adversary, that supply was cut off. So the Turks had to find other places, and there's quite a coal reserve up on the Black Sea. But these ferries, of course, are not outfitted for anything other than the Straits, and not even for the Sea of Marmara, much less the Black Sea. So a lot of them were lost in storms. And of course, the Russians and the British submarines were picking them off as well. But as I say, for anybody who's this is a great reminder of what those ferries, the war effort that they showed in World War I. Again, fascinating stuff. Now, this one is special, and this was a bit of a scoop, at least as far as I was concerned, in the term. And this was a newspaper article in the 1930s written by a Turkish journalist. And it's based on his translation from French into Turkish of material from Russian originally that was translated into French. And what it is the the Russian documents related to the secret negotiations between Enver Pasha in particular and the Russian ambassador at the time in Istanbul. And while Turkey was very much in the German camp, and that was only accelerated by the arrival of the two German warships in August of 1914. But at the same time, Enver Pasha, the wily fellow that he was flirting with the Russians to the point where he offered them an army, an Ottoman army, for the Russians to use in the Balkans if they would not go to war against Turkey. And that, of course, all fell through. But for me, that was something of a scoop. I had no inkling that that Enver Pasha had been playing those games. But this story, a Turkish officer behind Russian lines, this is 1877, and this is like an Errol Flynn movie, where this young Ottoman officer is sent behind Russia to meet with the then Grand Duke Nicholas, the predecessor of the one I was talking about before, to try and set the rules for engagement between them in what is today northern Bulgaria on the front. And he had just an amazing time getting behind the lines and making it to the Grand ostentatious and fabulous tent where he had an audience with the Grand Duke and then somehow made a remarkable trip back to his Ottoman encampment on the other side. This is probably the one that I'm most proud of, I should say, and it's this one, and it's the story. It's not the story. It's the personal accounts of prisoners of war who were incarcerated by the Russians in World War I, and then by the Turks during the War of Independence. And after they were released, they wrote down what they'd been through. And then the Turkish government published these things in Ottoman, and I transcribed them and translated them. And it's just phenomenal what these fellows went through in the prison camps. Very graphic, very brutal, but firsthand, and that's just remarkable. Now, as I said, we were going to get to the end. This is the last one that I'm going to mention. Of course, there are about 100 or more than 100 of these translations on academia, and I should say that whenever I do anything about subjects, most of the subjects that I've talked about, people are interested, but they don't get excited. But whenever I do anything about the Turks and the Armenians, I can guarantee you there will be some excitement. And it's remarkable. There's a capability to comment on academia, and these folks just go after each other tooth and nail. The Armenians and the Turks, whenever I do any translations about that issue from 1915. And I put one out today, so I'm bracing for the reaction. I'll see if I can make it back to the hotel. But this was great because I think most everybody knows all there is to know about Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. But this was something I didn't know anything about. And at the time of the fall of Abdul Hamid II in 1908, 1909, 1908 in particular, his superiors sent him to Tripoli to kind of get him out of the way because it was a bit too excitable, perhaps, and very influential and persuasive. So his superiors wanted him to go elsewhere. So they sent him over to Tripoli to see what was going on there, and which was at the time still in Ottoman possession and under Ottoman rule, which would change shortly thereafter, thanks to the Italians. But these documents from the French archives were found by a Turkish researcher and seemed to be, to his knowledge, the first reflection of Mustafa Kemal in diplomatic material before he became famous. Let's put it that way. And even at that time, he made quite an impression on this French diplomat there in Tripoli. And I found that there was a British, another author, another researcher, I should say, found British diplomatic traffic from Tripoli in that same time frame. And it was similarly impressive in terms of the reaction to him in particular, and as events would proceed, he would become probably, you know, one of the most incredible people that I have ever known about. And I, you know, now that I know so much about him, I'm continually impressed by his capabilities, and the Turkey that is today, that I live in and that you've all visited, is the consequence of his brilliance and his genius and his will. So that was a fascinating find for me, just because I didn't know anything about his earlier career, going way back to 1908. So that's you know, that's a sample of the things that I've been working on. Working on another thing right now about World War I and the attack by the Ottomans and the Germans against you folks, against the British in Suez in World War I. And that'll take me another month or so to do. But, you know, it's a labor of love, and I just enjoy it very much. So as I say, it's kind of selfish, but, you know, at the same time, I think it's, you know, it fills a niche. So as I said, or maybe I didn't say it, but I should have said, I'm not, and certainly don't claim to be an Ottoman scholar. The material that I deal with is probably the simplest of Ottoman, besides those little notebooks and some of the other things that I've done. But for the most part, I do this because I can do it myself, and I don't need to bother other people to help me. But if I didn't have the Red House dictionaries, I would be up the creek without a paddle. And Sir James Redhouse did us all a wonderful service by putting together these wonderful dictionaries that, as I've noted here, when I work with Turkish Ottoman scholars and they see the contents of the Red House dictionaries, they are amazed, because there are things in the Red House dictionaries that they can't find anywhere else. And this is an example. The script that you see there is Divani script, and it's from around 1566, where Suleiman the Magnificent is giving some orders to the Janissaries to go up to Romania and face off against the folks up there. But these are things that my Hoja, Ilhan Shaheen, who is one of the ultimate Ottoman scholars in Turkey these days, but he helps me when I have trouble. He helps me, and he gave me the transcription of these two in particular. And then I also wanted to thank Craig for this, which was on the registration form.
You do show on the
Yeah, and I knew that, you know, it was from the War of Independence, and, you know, the Turks throwing the Greeks out of Anatolia. But what I was surprised to learn was that these 4 lines here are from the Turkish national anthem. There are 10 stanzas in the Turkish national anthem, and this is one of them. And then over here on the left, it says, you know, go back to your mothers. Essentially, you know, you see the Turk grabbing the Greek by the collar, and he says, go back to your mother. So that was that. I have to thank Craig for bringing that to my attention. And that pretty much wraps it up as far as I'm concerned. You know, I'm happy to have anyone get in touch with me. There's my email, and there's yours truly on the Moda Katakoi tram this summer when my daughter came to visit. But as I say, it's it's a fascinating place to live. The traffic is horrible. The drivers are crazy. But at the same time, you know, every day is fascinating. And I just moved from Caddebostan to Feneryolu last week. And this is, anybody can relate to this. Whenever you move, it's horrible. And this was no exception. So please, if you want to wish me a Geçmiş soon, I'll accept it. But I got through it, and that's the important part. But thank you very much for having me here today, this evening. It's been my pleasure. This is, as I say, a labor of love, and something that I can do, you know, forever. I guess you could play tennis forever, pretty much too. This is what I like to do. So thank you once again.
Thank you. I'm going to stop screen sharing, and then we could do some question and answers.
Stop share, okay.
Yeah.
Well, so who has questions for our speakers? We'll begin with the room before we go on online.
Okay.
We already have one about the Italian invasion of Abyssinia. Would you want to ask about that?
No, I was intrigued in the report of the purported negotiations between Izet and the Russians before the outbreak of the First War.
Right.
What sort of war was Izet thinking the Russians might wage in the Balkans?
Well, evidently, they were under some pressure from, I guess, various factions in the Balkans. I'm not exactly sure, but Enver was of the opinion, and they seem to be accepting his offer of this Ottoman army that would protect Russian interests in the Balkans in some way, shape, or form, to head off a war between Turkey and Russia. But then the German ships showed up, the Goben and the Breslau showed up at Çanakkale and made it up to Istanbul, being chased by the British And that pretty much sealed Turkey's relationship with Germany as far as which side they were going to take in World War I. But Enver Pasha, I've done a number of, I found a couple of interviews that he gave before that point. It was in the spring of 1914, and then another one in 1920 when he was in Baku, after he had left Turkey. And then in 1922, when he threatened, he was with the Basmachi out in Central Asia, in Tajikistan and in that area out there. But he threatened Trotsky with an ultimatum, essentially saying that, you know, you leave alone or we're going to, you know, we, the Basmachi, the Muslims of Central Asia, are going to make it tough for you. But of course, that didn't work out well for Enver Pasha, and that was a couple of months later. He was killed out there. But believe me, fascinating guy. Sort of in the way I have come to know him, sort of the antithesis of Mustafa Kemal in terms of personality. And the thing I'm working on right now, the author of the article I'm working on right now was the Ottoman military attaché in Paris at the outbreak of World War I. And so he had to leave Paris and get back. That's another story, his trip back from Paris to Istanbul. But then once he got back to Istanbul, he had to pay a courtesy call on Enver Pasha, who was the acting commander-in-chief in the emperor's stead, sultan's stead. He was the commander-in-chief of the Ottoman army. So as the returning Turkish military attaché from Paris, he had an audience with Enver Pasha, and that was very revealing in terms of his distaste for Enver Pasha as a dictator, a Napoleonic dictator. And yet he said that 9 months before that, when he had met with Enver Pasha before going to Paris, he found him to be very modest and very likable and very friendly and warm. And yet in those 9 months between the time he left for Paris and the time he returned, he saw this dramatic change in Enver Pasha's personality, where he had become this Napoleon. And then I think we all know what happened from there in terms of Sarıkamış and the remainder of World War I, and then flight to Germany and then to Russia and Central Asia afterwards. But the two of them, Enver Pasha and Mustafa Kemal Pasha, are just never-ending sources of fascination for anybody who is interested in Turkey for the last 100 years, or that period in particular, of course. But just all sorts of stuff comes up that you just don't expect. At least I don't expect it.
Pity that those Turkish-Russian contacts didn't lead more fruitfully.
Yes, because little notebooks would not have been written, and that fellow would not have had to go out to prison camp for 3 or 4 years.
And who knows what might have happened to the Ottoman Empire?
Right. There's so many what might have beens.
I remember in the 1980s, when I was in Ankara, there was an idea that they had discovered that actually the Germans had bought Enver with a rather large amount of gold as a personal incentive. Have you come across that story?
I've heard it. I don't have documentation for it.
Right.
But I have. I've heard it, and it wouldn't surprise me.
It's logical, isn't it?
Yes,
Because
it is.
There was no obvious reason to everything. So you didn't have to.
No, he didn't have to. And that's the thing I'm working on right now. This fellow, Ali Fuat, who was the one who actually did the heavy lifting in the attack on Suez. But he was very much an anti-war person. And he said, you know, as his interview with Enver Pasha indicates, he didn't think this had to happen. He thought that this could have been worked out. And I think anybody that looks at that period and the events that happened would agree that this really did not have to happen. The Turks did not have to go to war. And it was just essentially, and this is why it's so dangerous for one person, you know, to be the last word anywhere. Because if that person is the wrong person, then you get into all sorts of, and I think that's what happened to Turkey in World War I.
Am I right that the Sultan didn't know about the attack on Russia?
He did. I don't think he did. I think Enver Pasha took the title of acting commander-in-chief to heart and just pretty much did whatever he wanted to do. And I don't know how many fans of Vladimir Putin there are in the room, but it reminds me very much of Putin in the sense that he's very intimidating, very persuasive, and perhaps evil in some sense. But the tragedy of Sarıkamış, and I've done a lot of work on Sarıkamış and that calamity, and the indifference of Enver Pasha to the consequence of Sarıkamış is just remarkable. You know, I don't think the estimates of 90,000 Turkish soldiers having died in that, it wasn't the battle, it was the cold, you know, it was the frozen weather that killed most of them because they weren't properly clothed and they didn't have proper shelter or food or anything like that. And that was all the consequence of poor planning and hasty decision-making, almost like Napoleon going to Russia, you know.
Of course, as we've seen quite recently here, decision can be taken by one or two people, which do have very calamitous consequences.
Yes, you know, I've been careful not to.
So, more questions for us, perhaps about Ottoman.
Yeah.
I mean, one obvious thing is the extraordinary variety and fruitfulness of the Ottoman kind of casual literature production at that time, which one doesn't really realize until one engages with it.
Right.
They were producing a lot in Istanbul at that.
Yes, remarkable. You know, as I think I mentioned somewhere, but most scholars of Ottoman get deep into the archives because the archives are, you know, prestigious, and they're wonderful. They are. You know, I've done some work in the archives myself. That's where I'm Ilhan Şahin, and we've had, you know, more than 10 years of working together. But there's all this material as well that I don't think anybody else is working on besides me, and I think it just brings a lot of material that would otherwise be unknown to the larger audience of the English-speaking world, because otherwise it just resides in Turkish or in Ottoman, and nobody knows anything about it. You know, so it's sort of a never-ending mission of mine.
Do you have a sense whether this, in most Istanbul printed production in those days, was newspapers or literary journals or casual novels, and how it was distributed? It
was pretty prolific in the sense that there are lots of journals that I have been exposed to, lots of newspapers, and I'm finding this out because the Turkish historical societies and universities have these wonderful repositories on their websites of Turkish material and Ottoman material. So you find all this stuff that is ignored essentially by a lot of people because it's not from the archives. But at the same time, I think it's wonderful stuff. So I'm constantly searching and taking recommendations from people to work on things that will keep me off the golf course, which is not really a problem.
Would you like to talk a little bit about the technical way that you were able to translate these little matchbox things? I think that people will be very interested in that. So
Yeah,
obviously it must have been very difficult to do.
well, it would have been, let's put it that way. But my brother-in-law, who lives in San Francisco, my wife's brother, is a technical whiz. So, and he's also he has great patience. So he took pictures of each page and put them on a secure website. So I was able to work from those pictures rather than with a microscope and a magnifying glass, work from this. But at the same time, there are, whenever you write anything, we all scratch out and, rewrite and whatnot, but there's really none of that here. And he's writing with a needle.
So he's writing fluently, very few corrections. So when you blow it up, you see the script fully formed.
Absolutely.
He's not using lots of abbreviations and
No.
He's just writing normal Ottoman.
Right. That's why, it's almost physically impossible that he was able to do this and to do it in prison camp and to hide it from the Russians in the matchbox.
In Siberia.
Yeah, and then it made it to today.
And the ink he used is still lasting. He didn't use something that faded completely.
Right. It's, as I say, I'm constantly amazed. And there's a sort of the dean of Turkish and Ottoman scholars, Ilber or Taylan in Turkey, and another fellow named Sunay Akın, who's a very famous Turkish personality. These are wonderful people, and I've shown both of them this, and then their jaws just dropped. There are Qurans, for instance, that are written like this.
But printed, not also manuscript ones.
I've
seen printed Qurans, that's more.
Probably, because if they're from, a couple of hundred years, they would have had to be handwritten. But when they saw this, it's hard to impress such people. But when they saw this, they were shocked. And it's just an amazing story, but one that I've been fortunate to be involved in. There are two notebooks in this matchbox, so it's about 300 pages total. Yeah, and it extends from January 1915 until March of 1917. And he stopped at that point, but he didn't leave the camp until the summer of 1918. So he stopped writing, and the last year of his incarceration in the prison camp is not here, but fortunately he wrote a biography, 1950s, in which he fleshed out what happened afterwards and how he didn't really escape. They almost tried to escape, he and his buddies in the prison camp. But of course, the Russian Revolution had happened, and things were in total turmoil there. And somehow the Turkish people at the embassy in Moscow were able to get them out and back to Istanbul through Poland and Germany and the Balkans. And then he needed a profession, so he went to school to learn engineering, taking geometry and algebra and all sorts of mathematical courses. And he became he was the person who established the radio link between Istanbul and Ankara in the 1950s. He was working for PTT at the time. He was their chief engineer. And then he did other, as you can imagine, somebody who can do this can do other stuff.
Do you know why he stopped writing?
No, and that's his daughter, or his sister, actually. My wife's grand aunt, if you will, was the one that told us about the needle and the ink and whatnot, but she didn't know why he stopped. And he doesn't, in his biography, he doesn't write that either. He doesn't write too much about this in his biography. But his son, my wife's father, held on to this throughout the years, and he tried to get it transcribed and translated, but nobody ever had the time or the inclination to dig into it. And again, this may have been part of the fact, may have been that in the 70s and 90s in Turkey, there was almost an ignoring of Ottoman times, in favor of the Republic, and sort of a repression of Ottoman. So it may be that was part of the equation, but it was my luck that this thing survived until I got a hold of it, and it was fascinating to work on it, but I needed an awful lot of help because certainly it was my first project, and it's written in handwritten script as opposed to this material, which is printed, of course, and it's a lot easier to work with this. But when, as you know, handwriting can be very tricky. But great stuff. Anyway.
More questions for the speaker? I think we just have to thank you for a thoroughly fascinating and
Should we just ask anybody from
So I
Zoom?
don't see anybody with their hand up.
Any questions from you?
I don't think so. Peter isn't.
There's something in
No.
the chat.
Chat.
Yes, there's from George. Also, well, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Well, no, I don't think it's a question, Craig. Have a look in the chat.
I think I have unmuted. This is not a question. This is so fascinating. And I feel so embarrassed that I did not know about material, and I did not know about your page on academia. I just looked it up, and now I'm writing while you're talking all over. But all historians and students, they should be looking at your page and downloading that fantastic material. Thank you.
Oh, well, very much appreciated. And it's, it's just a lot of fun for me, and something to keep me busy.
Oh, gosh, fantastic.
I'm not necessarily out of trouble, but busy.
George Angel, do you want to ask your question while unmuting yourself, or should I read out the comment box?
We'll go ahead, since I wore out my fingers typing it.
Republican Turkish shows a steady development away from the old language from the 1920s through the 20th century, a dramatic process of jettisoning Persian and Arabic-based vocabulary. Was such a process at all already in evidence in the late Ottoman period, or did Ataturk's language reform represent the real beginning of the purification of Turkish?
There were a few efforts in the teens to change the Ottoman script into Roman alphabet, so to speak. But again, one man with the will and the ability to do something did it in 1927. And you can see, as I was saying, you know, this magazine was up until about 1927 or 28 was in Ottoman. And then from then on, it was in a modern Turkish script. So his impact and his and the inability of anybody to say no to Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, I think was the deciding factor in that transition. And then I think a lot of people may or may not know about Ataturk's fascination with the Mu empire, which was, in his estimation, sort of the foundation of the Turkish nation, sort of a bit of a fantastic story that you can look up on the internet. A fellow named Churchill, not the one you're thinking of, but he proposed this idea of the Mu empire that was, you know, from the distant past, that had other world connections, and MU is the word. And if you look it up in Google and add the name Churchill, you'll find out all about that. But since we have George front and center here, I want to say that George and I have been translating other stuff from Turkish novels in particular. And the thing we're working on these days is Sabahattin Ali's İçimizdeki Şeytan. And George is a relentless pursuer of such things. And we work on this day in and day out. And it's another fantastic, I don't want to call it a hobby, mission, I suppose would be the better word, that George has initiated and drafted me into. We've already done Yaprak Dokumu, and we did from Turkish, and we've done also Kirk Montalo Madonna by Sabahattin Ali as well. And so I want to make sure that George is recognized for that, the efforts that he has put forth in that regard.
Well, could I just ask something in that regard?
Sure.
Jack, you can hear?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And my question is, and this reference to the question that I had sent over the chat, you addressed the change of script, but I was thinking more, I mean, once Turkish goes back into the Ottoman script, I'm blind to it. You know, that's all dark to me because I have never learned the script. I've never learned to read Ottoman. But certainly when I do start reading in the 1920s and mainly the we've with the Yaprak Dokumu, it was published in 1930, I believe. So you're seeing a very old Republican Turkish, and you can really see, even in your career and my career, we saw Turkish change rather dramatically. But what I was really asking, not about the script, but the underlying language, do you see from, say, the 1850s or wherever you have begun your work, up through the fall of the Ottomans, do you see, or not just the fall of the Ottomans, but the end of Ottoman script in 1928, do you see any significant change of the language itself? Is it moving towards something like early Republican Turkish, although written in Ottoman script?
Yeah, and I think part of that is the intervention of European languages, and French in particular, because French was so dominant as far as Ottoman diplomacy was concerned. And I see a lot of this French moving into Ottoman from the mid-1800s onward. And then I've done a lot of work on maritime subjects. I worked on a ship's log of a ship that was involved in running guns from Russia to the Kemal's forces across the Black Sea from Novorossiysk during the War of Independence. And when we were working on that, there was so much Italian. The maritime language, was all Ottoman, but sprinkled heavily with all of this Italian and French maritime language that the Turks had adopted. And then, as I think you mentioned, George, Ataturk really wanted to not only change the alphabet, but to find Turkic words to replace Ottoman Arabic and Persian words. And the Turk Dil Kurumu, especially in the early years, made great efforts in that direction, trying to find and sometimes inventing words from Turkic roots that would substitute for Ottoman Arabic and Persian words. And that is what I think you and I saw in our careers, to the exclusion of Ottoman. We saw a lot of that in the material that we worked with over the years in the the 80s and 90s or whatever. And that was I think a trend that was reversed in the early part of this century with the change of regime in Turkey. But nevertheless, lawyers still have to know an awful lot of Ottoman, because much of the Turkish law is still written in words that are essentially Ottoman words. And when Turkish youths go to law school, they have to immerse themselves essentially in Ottoman in order to be able to comprehend Turkish law. It's not that as difficult as it used to be, but it still involves knowing a certain amount of Ottoman in order to handle Turkish law today. But it's been a migration, I think, was moving towards a Turk goal when the Turk Dil Kurumu was under the auspices, if you will, of the Demirels and the Ejevits and Menderes and the people, the folks that came in back of Ataturk. But then at the beginning of this century, and for better or for worse, that has changed. And there's now a reversal towards an emphasis not on Ottoman history, but a glorification of Abdul Hamid II in particular as a role model, which is, of course, another subject that would take an awful lot of time to sort out.
Is there greater study now of Ottoman script?
There is these days, yeah. That's what I've encountered. Like when I was going to, I went to many classes to try to build myself to the point where I could do this. but they were all packed. And they were all young people desperate to learn Ottoman. And then at the archives, you know, just packed to the rafters with people. Whereas probably 20 years ago, that was certainly not the case. But since the change in tone or regime, whatever we want to call it, in Turkey over the last 20 years, there's been this re-emphasis on Ottoman language and Ottoman history, sometimes at the expense of the Turkish Republic legacy, shall we say. That's what I've noticed. Fascinating, always, you know, every day is fascinating, and the Dizzies are great. I don't know if you watch the Dizzies, but I do. And most of the Dizzies, you know, the TV shows are based on very wealthy people living in Istanbul who don't work, but they live the high life, you know. And I often think that the kids out in Anatolia watching these Dizzies say to themselves, "Hey, what am I doing here? I'm going to go to Istanbul, not work, live like a king, and just have the time of my life." But of course, it doesn't work out that way. But anyway, as I say, Turkey is a very, very interesting place to live for me. And I'm sure you folks with your organization here are very much immersed in things Turkish all the time. If I can be of any assistance, you know, being there on the ground, so to speak, please let me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we just have to thank our speaker for a thoroughly entertaining and informative.
No, my pleasure. Yes, thank you for having me. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, my pleasure.